Hey folks, this is Craig from Acid Horizon, and if you are going to be in New York City on November 9th, in Brooklyn in particular, we want you to attend The Headless Politics of George Bataille, featuring us and Stuart Kendall, whom you probably remember from our multiple episodes with Stuart. The event will be held at Public Records in Brooklyn and will be held from 4 to 6 p.m. This is a great time to come meet us, meet Stuart, and meet other friends of the Acid Horizon podcast. We would love to see you there. Please navigate to the Durations Festival link that's in the show notes, where you can purchase a ticket to our event or purchase a ticket for the entire festival, which features notable musicians like Andy Stott and others. In any case, mark your calendars and save the date for November 9th from 4 to 6 p.m. in New York City. We hope to see you there. Up next, we have Dan McQuillan with Resisting AI. Let's have a listen.
So-called AI is fucking everywhere. If you've seen it on your phones, you have seen the slop. You've seen Shrimp Jesus. You've seen ChatGPT paragraph by paragraph summaries of various things, great from Wikipedia yourself. If you put yourself into them, you've probably seen that maybe you've written 10 or 15 books that you haven't written. Maybe it says you're dead. But sadly, in the age of hyperboosterism and in the age of the post-free money era of no longer zero interest rates, AI seems to be everywhere. It's burning us up. It's intensifying various kinds of repressive practices. It's even being used in genocide. But first of all, what is it? What does it mean? What can it do? And how do we fight it? And today, we are honored to be joined by Dan McQuillan, author of Resisting AI, an Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Intelligence, to do just that. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So when we say AI, what do we mean when we say AI? Because typically people mean LLMs, but if you talk to the people that are making them, that are promoting them, that are boosting them around, they say that it really is an actual man-made intelligence. And it's something that is in its latent stage, and eventually, if it isn't now, it will become an AI. But really, if we want to strip away all of those images, all the marketing campaigns, all of the VC money, when we're talking about critiquing and resisting artificial intelligence, what sort of operations are we trying to resist?
Right. I mean, the history of so-called artificial intelligence, has two broad family trees, I suppose. One is what's now called GoFi, good old-fashioned AI, and that artificial intelligence was always a marketing term because it was done by a bunch of people who wanted to distinguish themselves from the cyberneticists of the time. It is taken seriously. Both bits are taken seriously, particularly the I bit. One approach to the I bit was trying to essentially have a kind of rules-based system that emulated reasoning of some kind. And then the other approach was, let's make some bits of computer that look a little bit like neurons, basically. And we can have some inputs and they can be weighted, and then they can pass on to some other of these artificial neurons, and they can be weighted, and so on and so forth. And those things have existed alongside each other for decades. But there is an era going on. It didn't start with generative AI. That's when it sort of rudely shoved its way into everyone's everyday life. But it did start quite recently. It started around about 2012. So you could say the Aztecs were right, really. The convergence, really, of stuff that made neural networks come into something practical, something deployable, something that beckoned forth lots of these kind of grandiose visions and aspirations, and also some rather grim applications, right? And the convergence that happened, because these ways of constructing a form of computation, form of machine learning, that's what all this stuff is, right? So it's not, machine learning is a broader category. Machine learning is where you don't program something in a procedural way. You don't say if, then, that, blah, blah, blah. You construct an algorithm that will take in a load of data and do something and change in response to that data, usually in terms of recognizing patterns in that data. That's machine learning, and that's a very broad family. This AI, artificial neural networks, or neural networks, a particular kind of it, uses these arrays of artificial neurons. And it's not really that many practitioners believe that is now like the brain. They just believe it could create intelligence. And it was never really that effective because there wasn't the computation, there wasn't the data. When social media came along, on the one hand, the internet as a substrate, and then social media, and then with lots of, for example, lots of data and lots of labeled data. If you think back to sort of Flickr and Facebook and so on. And then on the other hand, these chips called GPUs, which were, originally designed for gaming, but then the people doing the artificial neural networks realized that the kind of maths that you needed for ray tracing and gaming and all that sparse matrix manipulation, that was like bang on. That was just what they needed, which is all a very strange kind of twisted evolution, because you've now got NVIDIA as momentarily the most highly capitalized company in the world, So it's a very, very funny thing. But it was really that convergence of data and processes that could make this stuff real in a way. And some particular algorithms that were also some modulations of the algorithm at the time, particularly convolutional neural networks. So they're the things that recognize images. That led to the whole, we don't need radiologists anymore because, AI can do our cancer scans. I mean, that came before generative AI. Generative AI, large language models, they're another kind of accretion on top of that. They are, internally, I mean, I loathe them. Let me make that clear from the start, but they are internally quite sophisticated in terms of the manipulation of data that they do. And they add, the features that we may come to discuss to AI. So there's a long history of AI, but there is a kind of recent Cambrian explosion in AI, which was around 2012, and that was neural networks became the only game in town, particularly with convolutional neural networks. And then I wrote a book dissing it all, and then 6 months later, out came, generative AI, which is more grist for the mill, I guess.
Well, it seems like very much the principles of the operation seem the same in terms of at least the basic premises of extrapolating results from data based around preperceived parameters, essentially trying to not only learning through feedback, but they seem like they're primarily what I guess one would call feed forward. In terms of they try to preempt the mistakes that would be made, and they learn that their feed forward learns through feedback. They learn how to get better at preempting.
They're exactly that. They're inference machines in a way, and their sort of fundamental operation is optimization. I think it's probably an open debate amongst people who would be sort of reasonable enough to have it, whether any of this stuff's got actually to do with statistics. When we talk about it in statistical language, and we talk about these as kind of statistical programs, but they're not statistical in the sense of statistics, this very well-founded form of data analysis that can, for example, give you clear bounds of confidence in the results they're producing. This has nothing to do with neural networks or so-called AI. It's using some similar methods mathematically to run an optimization engine. But I focused on neural networks because I thought, actually, I wanted to read between the very specific kind of stuff this was doing inside and what kinds of political and social consequences would most closely match or resonate with. Because there was a lot of critique of AI. There's always been critique of AI, and there was quite a lot at that time. It seemed to me very sort of hit and miss. People would say things about AI that seemed to me spot on and then also really miss it because nobody was really, the people who knew what was going inside weren't engaging in critique at all. So I wanted to talk about these operations. I wanted to talk about the optimization that was going on. I also wanted to talk about the sort of fundamental opacity of these things, which I think has real quite profound consequences for any practical application. And also the fact that they are, to use a technical term, basically a bit crap in the sense that they are always, foundationally bound to produce the results that in LLMs we called hallucinations, or in the image models we called adversarial examples, for example. These are foundational to this kind of network. So they're really interesting, but they just kind of, they're just a bit sketchy.
And in terms of this aspect of hallucination, it's essentially, it's interesting for me because I've been seeing recent machines, for example, Nightshade, I think, comes out of, I think it was University of Chicago. There's like this AI poison software, essentially, where one can feed metadata into an image and sort of protect copyrights. We're even sort of finding ways to poison them. And the aspect of data here, I mean, insofar as more and more aspects of social life are being rendered intelligible as data for machinic processing, whether that be done by a machine or done by various people in institutional arrangements that function similar to a machine. I'm thinking of everything from hospitals to prisons to welfare services as great, processors of information. Where do you think that the real dangers are in terms of where the latent politics shows up? Because, of course, these machines are always presented as neutral. They're presented as calculation, and in terms of they're presented essentially as perfect homo economicus, that they can make the most perfectly rational decisions, and therefore we should delegate to them. And so where do you think that some of the most, obviously there's politics stripping for awareness from what the categories are to our belief in the categories, but where do you think there's a particular kind of cruelty in the shift towards moving or dataifying or making our lives more integrated with so-called AI systems?
It is a big question. I think it's most often in areas where there is a pre-existing cruelty. I'm just going to borrow a phrase from a friend of mine, Helen Beetham, who used this term pre-automation for the way a lot of the things that you described are already constructed: education, healthcare, welfare state, and a lot of our other institutionalized social relations, that they are already operating in a manner that makes it very easy to conceive of applying AI to it. But in applying AI to it, you accentuate essentially some of the nastier aspects of those things. And even with simple machine learning, that's kind of evidence. There was with very basic algorithms, that is the case, that we can see with the Robodebt scandal, or the machine learning, the various machine learning scandals in the Netherlands. These entities they're not neutral, obviously, because they're applied by a hegemonic system, but it's not just that here's a neutral tool that's powerful. It's not just a power tool that's applied by a bad person. It's that the only things these tools can do are increase the bad stuff. The only thing they can do is essentially sort of rank, sort, target, exclude. That's their internal operations again. So when you give those to an entity that already has a sort of institutional, cultural suspicion of the people that it's there to allegedly serve in some way, like the welfare system, where if you are putting it into a situation where there's already the feeling that most people are just, most of the people who are claiming benefits are potential scammers and cheats and frauds, then that's what the machine is going to serve up, but in greater numbers, and of course, intensifying those aspects that are already present in the system, when it's likely to be accentuated along racial lines, along gender lines, whatever it is, basically. So again, I wrote the book actually because I thought and this is blurred a bit with large language models and generative AI, but I felt that there were some spectacular aspects in the sense of the spectacle. There's some spectacular aspects of AI that were actually sort of distracting from what I felt were the more essentially sinister and far-reaching effects of it, which was the more invisible introduction of these things particularly across state systems. I mean, that's still kind of true in the sense that the spectacular aspect has grown spectacularly, with all the nonsense about existential threats and AI safety and so forth with the generative models. That's the same kind of nonsense, really. It's not where the problems are. And the problems are really just much more mundane areas of life, but with, potentially quite tragic consequences.
Regarding the, what you call the supercharged bureaucracy enabled by AI in the book, is it so much the machines themselves in terms of the actions, or is it particularly or it may well be both, but in terms of, is it just the actions, or is it particularly the speed at which they can be affected? If we wanted to lay out a diagram of what's being processed where, we can see the same sort of cruelties that are originating in various systems, be they a state or institution, and then they can be redoubled and accelerated with AI. And of course, with the additional sort of ideological component of a non-human aspect, one can pass it off as, we are just doing the machine. Is it just a problem of machinics, or is it also a problem equally of speed and acceleration?
And definitely speed, definitely scale, I would say. Scale is also the industry mantra, that really the industry virtue, I would say, actually. If you want to, I think it was Abeba Birhan and her collaborators, but there's a great paper that's titled something like The Values Embedded in Machine Learning. They did a sort of discourse analysis of the top 10 papers, top 100 papers at AI conferences. And, it was exactly what you'd expect. And something like scale would be constantly repeated to internal audiences as demonstrating the worth and value of what was being innovated. And of course, things like ethics and fairness and stuff like that, they start to come in towards the end because the industry realizes it needs to fight a little bit of a rearguard battle there. They're basically absent. Scale, I would say, is a good one, exactly because it captures the industry's own image of why the things that they're doing are great. And at the same time, critics like myself would point to scale as a driver of the plural harms of AI, because it's scaling the kind of harms that we're talking about. It's also the scale in terms of the material infrastructure, which we'll probably talk about at some point. I mean, I think in terms of what I was probably not particularly doing effectively in the book, but was trying to point to the aspect of, the sort of co-production of technical mechanisms and subjectivities. And that's really one of the reasons why bureaucracy also seems to be that kind of apparatus to me. So that's, again, where there was a parallel that, working in a bureaucratic environment, it does seem to have that kind of effect on people. And I found that was going to be, again, something that was accelerated and amplified by AI, the distancing thoughtlessness. I mean, that's why I was kind of just, doing a bit of a magpie effect on Hannah Arendt's stuff around thoughtlessness, because it does seem to fit so well with the kind of subjectivities that were produced through AI. So I think it's scale. There's also this aspect with neural networks in general of generalization. They're a funny kind of very slippery tool, because if you've got a bunch of data going in at one end and a bunch of classifications or whatever coming out of the other end, the funny thing about them is they're not black boxes in that sense. You can open the things up and you can really see the numbers, and that's quite a kind of illustrative exercise. You can see this vast array of numbers. I mean, it's very matrix-like. And those numbers could represent anything. I mean, everything has to be quantified at some point to get inside these machines, but it really could be anything. It could be a quantification of all of the podcasts of Acid Horizon and every other philosophy podcast, or it could be, IDF targeting information. It's, these things, the same kind of numbers and the same kind of operations. So it's very generalizable. I'm sorry, running away with myself, but one of the features of neural networks is that the mathematics behind them is provably a good approximation for almost any functional transformation, which basically means if there's some kind of relationship between the input and the output, however much that relationship is a matter of correlation, it's nothing to do with the causal basis of that relationship. It doesn't tell you anything about why the thing is happening. But if you can find some kind of pattern anywhere, these things will find them.
I want to switch the conversation to fascism and the relationship between technology and fascism. And there are different debates, right, about the emergence of fascism and its relation to administrative technology and governance. There are those who treat fascism as some sort of remarkable break with the history of liberal governance and this kind of staggering extra historical instance that needs to be given a kind of pure singularity. But then there are others. So that's kind of in a certain sense, the Bedouin understanding of fascism, that it's sort of the enemy of generality, this sort of hyper singular sort of thing that comes from the darkest abyss of governance. And then there are others who say that really it's continuous with the entire history of administration. And when we look at the history of the administration of life that was occurring kind of in the 19th century, before the rise of proto-fascist parties and the attempt to remove, degenerative art, degenerative beings, etc., there seems to be this complete evolution of a kind of economics that had to occur first, which was largely considered based on population analysis and a kind of vitalism, as well as the reduction of human life to economic productivity. And of course, this reaches its peak really in the First World War, right, with combat materiel, or whatever Junger called it. When it comes to resisting fascism and resisting AI, there seems to be a kind of kinship with anti-fascist practices of the 20th century and anti-fascist practices regarding AI in the 21st, which is an attempt at understanding how life becomes flattened, how it becomes consigned and indexed to technical analysis. So when it comes to anti-fascist movements today, which are just numerous, what kind of analogs do you see between what is needed in anti-fascist activism today and what was sorely needed in the early 20th century that was missing from those working to destroy the motion of government that led to fascism?
I mean, there's quite a lot of issues come up there for me, and so I don't have a snappy answer. I'll just try and dive in. So I liked the expression of the flattening, and I think that's another of the aspects of a very obvious aspect of the machinic nature of AI that struck me as having such powerful social implications was its reductiveness, and its reductiveness aligned to this kind of social sorting, social ranking, and so on and so forth. I mean, I was very keen to point out that it wasn't, a sci-fi technology, and was very rooted in the pre-existing institutional genealogies, for example, And that goes exactly with what you're saying, because I'm 100% from, school B, that fascism is not, also not something that flies in from left field or landed on a comet or something, but is very much a natural outgrowth of the processes that are already there under the right conditions, or I might say under the wrong conditions, and is always latent actually for me in the operations of these institutions. So I think that there's something to say about the inherent need for I guess it's for a kind of technopolitics for me, that we simply don't separate these kind of what I would talk about in terms of apparatus. And I mean, I nicked that idea of Karen Barad really because it works so well for me in terms of not having a foundational non-separation between those aspects which go on to become some meanings and subjectivities, and those aspects which go on to become the material and machinic. It just helps me. It's like an assemblage, really. It's not that much deeper or anything. Those apparatuses that we currently encounter, to me, are, I don't know, proto-fascistic. I mean, if I'd have been more fluent, I would have used Deleuze and Guattari's sort of microfascism more in the book, because that's what that articulates it to me. That there's a kind of flow of microfascistic interactions and stances and conceptualizations, self-conceptualizations and psychopolitics circulating all of the time and never went away. I mean, I'm sure everybody gathered here wouldn't think that fascism disappeared in 1945 or something. It has always been circulating. I think that the term that I found to express that in the consequences of the book, and it's still one that kind of works for me, is necropolitics, or Net Offer Killian Mbembe, because I think in a nutshell, the idea of a sorting machine that lends itself to designations of disposability seem to me both to describe what AI can do and also what would be most desired by many of the political currents that are currently active. And I mean, very transparently, I would look at the EU's approach to its external borders or something like that, really rendering certain human lives as less than human or not worthy of life, or however you want to put it, which is exactly Nazi ideology as well. I think, again, another current for me, I haven't got to the anti-fascist bit yet. Sorry, I'm still going on about the fascistic aspects of it. One that I kind of got out of writing the book, and I still find very immediate actually, is eugenics. That, and this maybe goes back to your 19th century references as well. That one of the core aspects of sort of fascistic DNA was this sort of was a eugenicist perspective on things. It somewhat preceded the explicit fascist movements that we identify historically, but it certainly carried on afterwards, and is rising up again, I think, in parallel with the re-rise of fascist politics and the re-rise of fascist street movements, a generalized eugenic perspective in many different ways. And I think COVID-19 actually really was a case in point. So those kind of things, necropolitics and eugenics, also work for me as trying to label aspects of what I called, I think, or I can't remember what I said in the book, to be honest, but fascistic solutionism. So techno-solutionism is the term that people apply to the idea of, here's a social problem, don't worry, we'll fix it with tech. And I felt that these particular forms, particularly this kind of AI in this moment in time, is amounted to a kind of fascistic solutionism. And my aspirations in terms of the anti-fascist aspect of it is really just, on the one hand, it's a generalized anti-fascist perspective. I mean, there's a local football club around here, a sort of amateur level football, might be semi-professional, I can't remember, but Clapton Football Club, who have revitalized that idea of, having an area of social activity, football and football supporting, but taking anti-fascism as just a core attribute. It's just like it's unquestioned. They are an and they label themselves as such. And I think because AI is something that is pervading all aspects of social interaction and institutional activity, to me, on one level, it's this idea that, okay, if you're doing a sort of school meetup group, or if you're doing a football club, or if you're doing anything, or if you're teaching in university, that understanding that in the same way that it might be assumed that you're going to be anti-racist or something, that you should be anti-fascist. I think in terms of an actual technopolitics, the kind of technopolitics that I'm trying to reach for does have very clear historical aspects, and that might be something like the Luddites, who fought their politics, in an overtly political sense, but also contesting the apparatus that was being introduced out of their time, and has some very clear articulations of it, to put down all machinery hurtful to the commonality. I mean, if I had something tattooed to an intimate part of my body, it would probably be that phrase, that's really says it for me. And if I look for contemporary manifestations of it, I'd say I mean, I'm really interested by a thing called the GKN factory occupation, which is in Italy, which was a former axle factory, which was, funny enough, even though it's in Italy, it was going to be shut down because it was acquired by a UK-based private equity company. But there was a residue of Italian law that's left over from the 70s, where workers had at least some right to occupy a factory as long as it was a permanent occupation. As long as they could keep it going, they couldn't be immediately and brutally evicted. And so the worker. So for me, it's the fact that it's the workers and community occupying this factory in a way, not just the workers themselves, not just reproducing the work that they were doing, but consciously thinking about how they contribute to this wider apparatus and choosing to change it. So they've gone down the road of trying to make cargo bikes and low lithium photovoltaic cells. But really, it's also the transformation and subjectivity so I'm trying to articulate the need for the simultaneous transformation of, if you like, material apparatuses and subjectivities at the same time. And to me, they don't have anything to do with AI as far as I know, but they are doing that in practice. And funnily enough, they take as their slogan "Insurgiamo," which means rise up. That is an old partisan slogan. So I don't know how much of a mishmash this sounds, but it all makes sense to me. It all makes sense to me that there's the possibility of an actual technopolitics that strikes deep enough to transform things that need to be transformed, both in terms of our material production and in terms of who we are together as collectives. And that is almost by necessity, yes, but also by its very nature, anti-fascist.
Yeah, I think that in a certain sense what you're speaking to, though, is that another element of technopolitics, whether it's capitalist or Marxist, has historically misunderstood the machine breakers. Marx was heavily critical of Ned Ludd, the Luddism movement, right? But this tendency to just reject Luddites as a kind of techno-pessimism does not really understand what they meant by technology, what they understood technology to be operating as and through. Even in contemporary books that I love, like The Bioethics of Enhancement is one book that I think of where they use Luddism as a kind of critical term. Melinda Hall's book, which I think is a great critique of some of the tendencies in the technological enhancement movements. She uses Luddism as a kind of critical word, saying that they have a kind of, let's just say, like an extraterrestrial understanding of technology or a pre-discursive understanding of technology, that it is inherently anything. The Luddites were never like that. The Luddites deeply understood that technology was heavily embedded in, we could almost say, a kind of ontology, how things existed, how they were present to us was being affected by the way in which we understood each other as labor power, as machines. And what I find so interesting about your technopolitics here is that you're not only connecting information with the politics that surround its circulation and appearance, but also how we appear to ourselves, like the whole biomechanics movement too, where we are reducible to a machine. And of course that's an oversimplification of it, but the GoFi movement that was replaced, really, and Don Idy talks about this, Hoagland as well. There are a whole lot of philosophers of technology that deal with this, but essentially the neural network element can't just be flat, again, to use that word, flattened to they're trying to make a brain, right? The kinds of decisions about human bodies, about effectiveness, about solutions, that the whole world comes down to effectuating positive change for the increased production of the very materials that the machine needs, creates a kind of circular logic that gets taken off. Or that takes off. So when you say that there's a kind of Luddism that needs to be necessary, are you arguing that we need to reapproach the Luddites, not even in the way that Verso book, The Luddites Were Right, did it, where they kind of just said, industrial capitalism bad, Luddites good, but rather, should we return to the Luddites in order to understand something sort of deeper about their politics? that is historically missed. Because I've not read a lot of the Luddite literature or the Diggers or any of that. I've got George Winstanley and all the people that might have influenced the Luddite movement, but I'm kind of a neophyte when it comes to the Luddites.
You'd still be able to, I suspect, also with the kind of voracious reading capacities that you guys have, you'd be able to cover the territory fairly quickly. There are a number of really good texts because there has been a neo-Luddite current, I suppose, probably since '68, I think. And there's a number of waypoints on it, and I'm not going to bother trying to rack my brains now to name them all, but they are okay. I mean, personally, I went back and I'm trying to remember the name of the book again, Nominal Aphasia, but there's a good collection of the still existing writings of the Luddites, most of which come from the Home Office archives in the UK, which is basically the sort of state secret police. And that's pretty much the only writings of the Luddites that are left. And you have to carefully analyze which ones have any reality to them. But certainly the threatening letters that the Luddites sent to mill owners could probably be, reasonably relied on, and some of the testimony and so on and so forth. Anyway, I would read that and feel that they, I'm not trying to say the Chartists got it all wrong, but it does seem to be quite funny that, I'm not trying to paint some kind of grand narrative, but to me, the Chartists are a kind of turn to representational politics. I mean, I know that they were a militant movement and I'm all for it, but it seemed to me to put all their eggs in one basket, this idea of the vote and this idea of representation. And, the idea of representation is interesting because that's what AI claims to do. And it's a representation machine. It claims to have, in fact, a superior representation, of the world than is available to mere humans. And that idea goes back to the, what Adam was saying earlier on about that there are people who really believe this thing is going to not only be intelligent, but super intelligent in some way. So I think there's a kind of angle of attack that's probably very open for philosophical undermining or philosophical taking apart, which is the idea of representation. And in any case, for me, the Luddite politics, whatever it was not that. It was one that saw the politics and the machines as distinct but inseparable. It experienced them, obviously, as a very direct force in their own lives and had their own sort of value system. I mean, they were contemporaneous, more or less, with, the sort of latent threat of the French Revolution in British politics as well. There were kind of Luddite uprisings in a way that did sort of small-scale civic takeovers and attempted to have an alternative vision of society. So, there's maybe sort of more tightly bound specifically Luddite activities of attacking machinery, but they weren't separate from a much wider political milieu, which did have a broader vision of an alternative society. That's what I'd kind of identify as a fruitful perspective when it comes to AI, to understand that this is, basically a highly politicized apparatus, but also there was a couple of points you mentioned. One was the whole productivity efficiency thing. Again, this is something that the industry itself would boast as being a feature of AI. I think it's kind of their kind of core concepts of capitalism in a way, of capitalist constant growth. And they are also things that seem to me to be nameable features of this machine that are going to cause much more human suffering the more it's allowed to operate. So that's, I just wanted to mention that. On the ontology side, I've come to the position, which I don't think I went into much, maybe a little bit towards the end of the book, that this is both a technopolitics and a sort of ontological politics, that there really are, that this machinery is, the specific apparatus of AI is again sort of nested within this longer sedimentation of a particular set of apparatuses or whatever, however you want to call it, also capitalism and maybe also some other. And that trying to escape from that, if you like, is also a matter of discovering not that simply that other worlds are possible, but that other worlds still exist. So one of the kind of strength areas, I have part of what I tried to deploy in the book was a little bit of this Karen Barrett, but also a generalized new materialism as a way of trying to understand this sort of technopolitics as indivisible. But I also find a lot of the posthumanism aspect quite problematic for me because of the sort of 100% entanglement, 0% agency kind of idea. And I have found, I guess for myself, a refuge, but I hope active solidarity by engaging with indigenous communities who are also fighting dataification. They're fighting data centers, but they're also still fighting after 500 years or whatever, the worldview that comes with this stuff. I don't know what they call the Western worldview with a capital W or whatever it is. That there are still existing other ways of living in the world and understanding what the world actually is. And they to me are, again, a vital resource for anybody, trying to, environments that I inhabit, that, the sort of local global north resistance to the furtherance of that system through the means of AI.
No, absolutely. And I think first of all, big ups to Clapton FC. Shout out to Stephen Chakakis. I know he's probably listening to this. I know he's usually
Okay.
he's usually down the grounds, but in my local team. But seriously, let's be. I really appreciate the politics here of critiquing representation, because as you say in the book, there's these various strands you bring forward to bring both a theoretical and a political resistance to AI, be that feminist standpoint approach to science to understand the social determinants of any category to form a data set, the epistemological approach taken by, as you said, Karen Barad, particularly their strand of view materialism, and then, of course, the Luddism. And then also someone who shows up in the book who I was not expecting to see, but was very glad to see, which is Gustav Landau, the education minister of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, and particularly this idea that comes in with short-circuiting representation through a kind of direct democratic system of workers' councils, but also broader people's councils. And it seems really that this problem of representation does go to the heart of any question around AI, and maybe indeed technology and politics in general, because as you were saying with the problem of colonization, and indeed racial profiling, gender profiling, the inherent transphobia and racism of facial recognition softwares, for example, is that the base epistemological level, it's a map territory distinction which AI solutionism will always ignore. You compare it to the trial, Kafka's trial, which delayed hyper-bureaucratic, omnipresent cruelty. But I think it's also the penal colony from Kafka. And listeners, if you haven't read the story, it's quite a short one where there is a machine on this penal island in which the punishment is delivered as such, where the machine writes into your body the law that you have transgressed. And that's basically what the violence of colonialism is. You find a map, you call it terra nullius, you can take it over on the map, and then you eliminate everyone under it. So you can say, okay, the map matches the territory, and now that we're drawing the borders on it, and we'll have to cut through as many people as we are cutting through the lines on the page to make the map and the territory match. And so this violence of representation, violence of abstraction that makes representation possible seems to be something that and did use the term short-circuiting here. But how does this short-circuiting work here? And how would you say it could go beyond not just resisting AI, but reconfiguring the relationship to technology? I mean, sometimes I wonder if this kind of politics, I mean, it's positively, is kind of an inversion of what Kant used to say about his philosophy, which was, he said, I will restrict knowledge in order to make room for faith. And here it's in a way similar in the sense of, not in the sense that all politics is faith, but restricting technocratic representational knowledge, data, to make room for politics, which is in a way the thing which this dataification is always constantly trying to preempt and therefore prevent from happening.
I'm definitely trying to do that in some way, or trying to contribute to that. I mean, it's interesting for me that you mentioned the science. It's kind of a nice reminder, actually, of some of the stuff that I wrote about in the book, because I haven't gone back to it in a while. And I think that's, as a kind of tell for people who might be listening to this conversation, you can read some of my understandings of things from the fact that I actually have a science background. That's my origin, but I'm skeptical towards the sort of reductive scientific worldview. And so when this AI thing came along again, when it was so, particularly in the early days, it was so validated and valorized on the basis of it, drawing directly from being a scientific project. I was like, are you fucking kidding? Have you never read any critiques of science? Do you know where this stuff is going? Come on. And try to. I am most immediately in the business of inversion, man, trying to very simply look at. So in that case, I was trying to say, what are the forms of knowledge generation that are not subject to the same abstracted view from nowhere. So I was looking for situated knowledges, and I was looking even just post-normal science, because I happened to encounter that in my own travels, if you like, because it also has a very explicit commitment to an expanded peer community. So, and really all the way along with this analysis of AI, the first step for me has been saying, okay, here's what the formation of AI's non-dualistic technopolitics is. what is the inversion of that? And I guess that's where I ended up, trying to sort of draw on philosophic concepts without being a philosopher of any kind, because I was trying to say that actually things are fundamentally different. The territory really isn't the map, but also to look for ways of it not just being a sort of territory that is not the map, but a territory inhabited and participated by active agents and collectives. So what I'm trying to say there is that the terms of mutual aid and solidarity, which I simply inherited, maybe in a slightly unquestioning way from sort of my own political praxis, my own political past, made sense to me to reread them through this lens, to say, well, where AI, for example, and very simplistically, is a separation machine, most fundamentally, it's an apparatus of its representations are all about separation. To say that actually we would get more out of fundamental assumptions of the world where we are fundamentally inseparable. And the logic that flows on from that fundamental inseparability is mutual aid, because, we're not even really helping the other in some fundamental way. We are together. And the same thing for solidarity as a kind of political activation of that. So that has actually been a critique of the book, that it's not very concrete in terms of its sort of anti-fascist or technopolitical recommendations, apart from the sort of general idea of workers' and people's councils. But I think, I still think the parameters are sort of valuable heuristics. And I think, my interest these days is more in saying, well, where is that actually potentially manifesting? Where has that manifested in a way that's more concretely identifiable, such as the Lucas plan, which I quote in the book, the sort of 1970s arms company where the workers tried to generate a completely different set of products, really, from their engineering knowledge. And I think, well, I'll shut up, but what I would briefly say there is just that it's interesting for me when you dig into any of these examples. I mean, the Luddites are so far away and there's so little known about them. It's very hard to do with them. I think that the book that I read, whose name I'll remember in a minute, was the collection of residual texts, also did a good job in terms of historically contextualizing it. So you can sort of, you can imagine what else they might have been thinking. But if you dig into any of these figures, like, I don't know, Landauer or anybody else, you'll find that they not only have some deployable political concepts around organization, around restructuring, but they also themselves had a very different understanding of subjectivity, of collectivity, and of how the world works and what it's made of. And even with Stafford Beer, because I've got this kind of residual interest in that sort of lost cybernetics aspect, there's the same sort of processes going on, a world that is foundationally unknowable, that is whose complexity exceeds any epistemological mechanisms reigning in, and what approach to the world that mandates, one of mutual adaptability, which I find again in some of the world understandings of First Peoples in the Americas or whatever. That's what I find, and I do chat about it. I'm not trying to impose a meaning on it, but I find that. I think the idea is for me to draw on the foundations of the slogan, I guess, from the 2000s, really, that other worlds are possible, but I would sort of add other worlds are possible and still exist.
It reminds me a lot of the title of one of Barrett's probably her most famous book on the philosophy of science, which is To Meet the Universe Halfway. Essentially, to stop trying to preempt life and somewhat trying to live it. And I agree. I mean, it's a tight critique of any theoretical work that there's nothing concrete. Well, but books aren't that concrete. That's why they're made of ideas and not guns. We can't be just Maoist about it just immediately. But I do think that in terms of resisting AI at the moment, it is very hard to find aspects of it in terms of the very individual ways in which we encounter AI. I mean, for example, in terms of data production in the day-to-day. I mean, so take an example, Tesco Club cards, loyalty cards for supermarkets. You're being paid for the data you make. That's basically what you get a discount for. And there are certain ways of making it useless. Like, if you share the card about, you can't pinpoint it to exact locations. Habits are hard to form because, who hasn't been at the till and someone says, I don't have a card on me. You pass it over, your data becomes a bit less reliable. Or even when you talk about no platforming as an anti-fascist tactic. And for listeners, if you don't know, we did an episode on no platforming and the sort of history of it with Evan Smith over on the Zero Books channel a while ago, if you want to check that out. because of the way in which we encounter them so much through the platform, particularly, which is inherently individualizing, and its subjectivity is practically Thatcherite. You know, you're making your own. Everyone's a kind of entrepreneur of the self. I mean, is the attempt sort of? I mean, just in the years sort of following this book, and of course in the rise of LLMs, do you think anything has changed in terms of the landscape of how do we resist? I mean, in the first and foremost, in terms of where AI appears at, the job center and the like, we can support each other at work in myriad of ways. The digital sphere, it's probably harder. Do we think that the sphere of resistance expanding at a kind of a similar rate to the sphere of AI as it penetrates our lives, or do we have to remodulate ourselves to the beast as it's changing in its new forms of LLMs and say, slop generators in which we can see like deep fake images?
I feel that there are compelling dimensions of resistance in our moment. And they, in some ways, one of the reasons why I think me and others, I was having this chat on yesterday, sort of stick with the AI bashing aspect of our work is partly because AI so completely condenses so many of the important currents of the present moment, which, funny enough, go back to Will's comment about the 19th century. There's so much about AI that is the sort of, it's not the final, obviously, but it's in this moment, the manifestation of lots of the 19th century, essentially, of the 19th century's colonial perspective, eugenicist perspective, or everything really, extractivism, the beginnings of the aspects of extractivism. I'm sure you can express it better, but to me, it's such a condensation of all these things that the potential for specific contestations of AI is that they could condense pre-existing social movements that are already opposed to, for example, climate change, for example, workers' rights, and actually one of my little enthusiasms at the moment is for counterposing ideas around a just transition, with the world that AI is bringing forth, because it's exactly the opposite. So again, there I'm just kind of doing the simplistic flipping around. I'm saying, well, look at what AI is doing, intensifying precaritization, immiseration at the same time, as basically being a sort of giant carbon emissions machine. So it is kind of the polar opposite of what a just transition would be. But by naming it that way, I'm also trying to, I guess, excite the attention of movements who are already committed to those ideas and see that AI is relevant to them and that resisting AI is relevant to them. I do value the tools, for example, that try to help artists make their work or creators make their work less vulnerable to AI. But I have to say, I've never been a kind of data saboteur in the sense that my reading of the algorithms, particularly the neural networks, is they have such a bastard capacity to deal with that stuff. I mean, that's almost what they're made to deal with, that they can, through sheer scale most of the time, and that's what they are, scale machines, they can overcome anything other than a mass movement's capacity to poison data in the end. I'm not saying that mass movement's never coming, but the problem there being as well that, and this comes back to something I think we were chatting about right at the beginning, but if essentially this stuff doesn't work, and we can really see that with generative AI. I mean, it literally doesn't work. It is just a bit shoddy, which again has Luddite echoes because their complaints about machinery was often related to the fact that the products are very shoddy. So these are shoddy machines, but the cost isn't going to be borne by the people, increasing their stake through these production of these shoddy mechanisms. It's going to be, unless we do something about it, it's going to be paid by the rest of us, because even though it doesn't work, even though those data representations don't in any way represent us, we will still be in some way coerced by them. We'll still be in some way constrained and limited by them. The mechanism doesn't have to work in that sense to further agendas and to cause suffering. So, those kind of things are, and funny you should mention Thatcherism, because I actually use the term algorithmic Thatcherism about generative AI because its capacities to it's just so completely transfers control. It's basically a mode of privatization and a mode of sort of worker immiseration. I mean, and to me, if you didn't believe it about AI in the first place, you really must see it in terms of generative AI as an anti-worker technology. Fundamentally, that's its only use. It doesn't do anything else effectively, but it sure as hell smashes conditions of workers and conditions of work. So I think that it's hard. I don't really have any suggestion for how to individually oppose AI, but I know for sure there are some areas where people should be opposing it right now. And one of them is the area that I work in, which is education. I'm absolutely on a daily basis kind of depressed and appalled by the sort of rollover. I mean, I don't want to sound like, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to select myself as somehow superior to this, but it's more that there's a kind of collective effect of people going, well, this stuff is inevitable, which makes them no different to everybody else. And also everybody in education is extremely brutalized and deracinated and has no energy to fight anything anymore. So there are many, many reasons why people do it, but still, in education, I still struggle to understand why people who are in the business of education would have anything to do with generative AI, and people who are in education and have some self-identification as promoting critical thought would have anything to do with AI. But it is in there. So I can easily identify that as an area where there should be individual and collective, individual resistance. Like, I'm not going to use that tool in my class, actually, thanks very much. But much more importantly, collective resistance. I mean, again, it's one of those areas which is, sort of, you kind of look at what the union perspectives on it, and I think they're starting to pick up, but they're still mostly disappointing. But hey, that's unions for you. So there does need to be a collective pushback in all sorts of areas. I mean, healthcare is another one. Again, it's another area of extremely, and this is a pattern, right? These things are being introduced in areas that are already brutalized and reduced. They're not just pre-automated, but they're sort of pre-devastated, and you come along with this solution. I mean, people are like, I don't know, maybe it will help. Something's got to help, because if nothing happens, I'm going to be checking myself into the psych ward, and maybe it's going to make my job worse, but it's hard to imagine how it's going to make my job worse, because my job is already terrible and half my colleagues have already been sacked. So, and yet it is so vital for any of these areas to form collectively, not just politically, but also to just understand the basic operations of these machines and why they will have exactly the opposite effect. They will simply accentuate all the things that are already bad and add nothing to the kind of aspirations that keep people in those areas at all, helping people, educating people, healing people. They will, contribute nothing to that. I just was going to mention, though, and I think it's related to that. Sorry, it's related to that and the resistance aspect, which is the Stafford Beer's posywid thing, the sort of purpose of a system is what it does. I mean, that to me is the aspect of fascistic or pro-fascist operation of AI at the moment. It is in those operational sides that I was talking about, but it's also very clearly at the moment, I think, in the same register as populism, in the same register as the politics that we see in the UK and many other places we see every day in the media. It's that idea of basically distraction, basically using something as a diversion from what is actually happening under the hood, what sort of deepening political desperation there is in the existing system, that the wheels are completely coming off and they don't have really any new ideas about what to do about it, but they sure as hell aren't going to give up on it, and they definitely are going to keep driving it forward, and they have to take attention off that fact, and they can do that by bashing immigrants, and they can do that by saying, hey, we're going to introduce AI, and in fact simultaneously in some cases, right? So I think that there's an aspect of pure diversion, distraction going on with AI, and that, my final point is, that's useful, because I think with all of the things where AI is introduced, or all of the things that AI claims to do, it's really a prompt to look over our shoulders and to say, wait a minute, if they are seriously suggesting that these stupid, shoddy, reductive and inadequate planet-destroying machinery can do any of this stuff, or is a legitimate substitution for anything that's been going on here, then what are we already doing? And why is it so different from what we want to do and the life that we want to live? It's always everywhere, it seems to me at the moment, a pointer towards the thing that should be other. And so I can then hand wave and say that there's a plurality of potential points of opposition to this stuff.
Yeah, I just want to close by saying thank you so much for coming on. You can find the book Resisting AI, an Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Technology, basically anywhere, but Bristol University Press is who it's with. I want to close with just, again, the words of Dan Hoagland, which is that the issue is computers just don't give a damn. But beyond that, so much of this comes down to trying to understand life, existence, being, whatever, as what things can do. This is something that's been hidden in the history of philosophy for God, at least since Aristotle, that things are defined by their capacities, and the reduction to all existence or basically all essence to the things that they can do is perhaps something that we all collectively have to re-examine. And rather than saying, let's reorient our labor capacity, maybe we should refuse the fact that we are all but latent labor capacity that must be put into the machine properly. And I think resisting AI provides us with a political tool set, or at least a historical account of ways in which our account of machine learning can sort of reinforce the worst parts of the way in which we govern ourselves and each other. So thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome, man. I cheer all those thoughts.
This is an amazing book. It's one, you're going to learn a lot about the computation. Two, you're also going to get an introduction to standpoint theory and new materialism, which is not three things you can get in incredibly readable packages like this one. I would even go as far, you wouldn't get that from any Oculus. It is we are far too continental, even our innovative aspects. This is an incredibly readable book. It gives you a hell of a lot of tools and a lot of good ways to find things that aren't just that goes beyond the philosophical into the computational, into as Dan was saying, into post-normal science. It is an incredible introduction to a whole range of fields, and honestly, things are only going to get worse. So we're going to need these tools more and more as things carry on. There'll be a link to the book in the show notes. Dan, thank you so much for joining us again, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks very much.